My name's Amy, and I work in digital at The Guardian. I'm a software developer on the data technology team. Our department is responsible for almost all of our digital products. So this ranges from the obvious, such as the website, theguardian.com, and our native apps. But we also produce other less obvious products like a content API and tooling for our editorial staff. We're a team of 150 people, so we're quite large. And when I joined 3 years ago, we'd already adopted an approach of continuous delivery. So we were releasing changes to our code hundreds of times a day. We're producing product features fast. It was all very well producing these features, but part of the feedback loop, if we wanted to make improvements to our products, was an understanding of whether our features were working. So an understanding of whether these features were having the desired effect on our audience. Yes, we were tracking and analysing all of the data to do with these features. But our teams had been optimised for delivering these features, not for analysing the data and not for understanding performance. If I'm honest, at this stage, we didn't really have these answers. So how did we overcome this? We introduced A/B testing. I want to share with you how this worked for us. And I want you to show you how we are learning to use this method in a way which doesn't slow us down, so in a way that doesn't slow down delivery. Through doing this, I want to convince you to adopt A/B testing as your way of measuring feature impact. And over the next half hour, I'm going to cover why you should use A/B testing, how you can implement it, and how you can choose what to test. If I can ask that you keep questions to the end, that will help me keep the schedule. But I promise I will leave 10 minutes, so we will get around to it. Which brings me on to my first point. Why should you use A/B testing? Now, we found A/B testing to be the only method which works. So for us, it's the only way we've been able to know the impact of our features. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a bit about how other methods haven't worked for us, so how other methods don't work. And then I'm going to go on to talk about how A/B testing does work, so how A/B testing does give you an idea of what the impact of your features is. So other methods won't show feature impact, bit of a bold statement. I want you to imagine that you're responsible for building our website, so you're a developer on theguardian.com. You're interested in increasing the number of people that you see to the site. So that's the kind of metric that you're interested in. One day, you make a change and you deploy that change. And you might be tempted to look at the data to see whether the change that you've made has had an influence on the number of visitors that you see. So you look at the data and you see a spike in this number, which is fantastic. Now, at The Guardian, anyone can deploy at any time from any team. So you don't have to be on the front-end team to make a change. So you're cautious not to attribute your spike to your change, and you check GitHub to see what other things have been merged on the same day before making any assumptions. You find that that day there had been 14 other changes, the biggest of which were perhaps a logo change and a bug fix on live blogs, so nothing huge. The next problem you have is that the day you released your change was the 9th of November. Now, for us being a new site, this was a really big day. This huge spike that you see here, where we see nearly 30 million visitors to our site, was the 9th of November. It's when Trump was elected. Big news, perhaps bigger news than our feature release. The point I'm making is, looking at your historical data, looking at this high-level data, doesn't really work in trying to understand what the impact of your specific feature was. You've got two problems here. One are all the other features that you're releasing. So I was saying that we average 15 changes a day on front end on theguardian.com. That's about 2,000 changes in the 6 months that we're looking at. The other problem is there are often factors other than your feature that affect your metrics. It's quite hard to find a metric that, for us, isn't influenced by the news cycle. But you can imagine if perhaps you're a travel website, something else like the time of year or even the weather might have a similar impact. So this poses a bit of a problem. How do you isolate the data and changes in the data that are due to your feature? Now, the next method we tried is one that I like to call before and after data. The first time we tried this out was for a feature that we released called the Minute. Now, the Minute was a daily news summary designed to bring back our users more often. We used a lot of jazzy tech around it at the time, and we kind of thought we were delivering a tech experience so exciting that people might come back off the back of wanting to view this product. We tried to move away from this approach, and instead we just looked at the users who had seen the Minute and compared their behaviour before seeing the Minute to their behaviour after seeing the Minute. I said we were interested in bringing people back, so the metric that we used was visit frequency. And this is how this looked. Our users had some visit frequency at some value before seeing the feature. And then on seeing the feature, their visit frequency was raised to some higher value. We'd seen a real jump in this metric, which was great, brilliant. We'd managed to show that a feature that we had made had changed our audience behaviour. Also, we thought, until we considered another explanation, this feature was released to support the US election. In fact, it was called the US Election Minute. Now, the people that clicked on the feature have already told us that they're interested in this topic, so they've clicked on something that is about the thing that they like. What if the increased visit frequency wasn't down to the feature itself, so all this tech that we've done to support it, but rather was just due to their increased interest in the news at the time? Again, for us, a real problem at The Guardian. It's really hard to disentangle changes due to our features to those due to the outside world and external events. So how do you overcome this? How do you isolate the effects which are due to your feature? We took this question to our team of data scientists, and fortunately, they had an answer for us, which you might have guessed is A/B testing. So how does this work? How does A/B testing get around this problem? To give you an idea of this, I'm going to sort of describe what A/B testing is. So when you release a feature as an A/B test, you set it up as an experiment where you split your audience into groups. A variant, who sees your changes, they see your feature, but also a control, who don't see your feature, don't see the changes. You release these two experiences at the same time. And this way, any differences that you see in behaviour are probably down to the difference in the experience that you've served, i.e. probably down to your feature itself. So why do I say probably? If this is the only thing that's different between the two groups, why isn't it definitely down to your feature? So I like to explain this with a bag of marbles, like a maths teacher. So here I've got a bag of 100 marbles, and in my bag I've got 90 green marbles and 10 blue marbles. If I were to take a sample of 10 marbles out of this bag, so if I was going to try and sample, let me backtrack. If I take 10 marbles out of my bag, and I look at the composition of my sample, so I look at the number of green marbles I've got versus the number of blue marbles, there are a few options for what I could get. I'm likely to get 9 green marbles and 1 blue marble. This kind of reflects the underlying distribution of blue marbles in my bag. But I could equally get 10 green marbles. Or, although unlikely, there are 10 blue marbles in my bag, so I could get 10 blue marbles. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that through the process of sampling your audience, so by splitting your audience up and splitting them into a control and a variant, you're introducing the possibility that there might be a difference in behaviour between these two groups before you even serve a difference in experience. So were we to run what we call an AA test, which is where you don't show that the experience that both groups see in your control and your variant is precisely the same, you might still see a difference in behaviour. A/B testing gets around this by introducing the concept of statistical significance. When you run an A/B test, you need to demand that the changes that you're seeing between your control and your variant aren't just due to chance, so aren't just due to this effective sampling that you get through the mechanism of testing. Don't worry too much about the details of this. I just mention it because later on in the talk, when I talk about implementation, how you choose what to test, this thing becomes a bit significant and a bit of a pain. So this takes me to my next point, which is we've got a theory for how we can understand feature impact, which is A/B testing. Now, how do we actually implement this? How do we go through the stages of doing this for our audience? Now, there are 3 stages to running an A/B test. You need to serve the features to a segmented audience. You need to then collect your audience data for your segmented audience, so for your control and your variant. And then you need to look for the differences in behaviour that you're seeing in these audiences and analyse this data for statistical significance, the marbles. Our first implementation of this was using off-the-shelf tools. So there are plenty out there. I think there's Optimizely, GA produces one, Adobe Omniture as well. So there are options for doing this. The advantages of these are that they're very quick to set up, and they don't require many, if any, developers or data analysts to start testing. You can use these straight away. We started doing A/B testing in this way, and it was great. But after a while, we did find that the tools had some limitations. The cost of these things tends to scale with your audience. And in our case, we see about 10 million people to the site a day, and this cost was kind of untenable. Because of the way that the tools work, they do have an impact on page load times, or at least the one that we were using was, especially on mobile. And we were also very limited in the types of changes that we could make and the data that we could collect. So for example, if we wanted to run a test using this visit frequency metric that I spoke about just then, we couldn't have done this with the tool that we had. Because of these limitations, we decided to implement our own A/B testing framework. So initially, we just built out the first 2 stages of A/B testing. We got serving tests to a segmented audience down, and we had ways of collecting the data for this audience so that, we had ways of collecting the data. This is well within our capabilities as a development team, and we got this off the ground pretty quickly. I think our solution's open source, so you can find it there if you want to see how we've done those 2 stages. The third stage, the analysis of the results, we tried to do manually. Now, the analysis of the results is kind of tricky. This statistical significance isn't a sort of trivial thing to look for. And we didn't have the skills on our team to do it. It wasn't that we weren't clever, it's just you needed a bit of a knowledge of statistics that we kind of didn't have. For this reason, what we used to do is we used to serve the test, then we'd collect the data, and then with the data that we'd collected, we'd take it over to Harry, our data scientist, and we'd say, can you look for statistical significance? We have these results. And Harry would get back to us maybe a day or 2 later after he's got out his bell curves and Poisson distributions and all that kind of thing. And he'd either say, great, you've done it, you've reached significance, you've got a result, this is better than this, or actually, no, there's no difference between the 2. Or he'd say, no, leave it a couple of days, you haven't reached significance yet, come back to me, and I'll get back to you then. Now, this dependency on another member of the department who was outside of the team was a bit of a blocker. He was getting really inundated with requests to run results, and it was really taking quite a lot of time. As you can see, this was a bit of a bottleneck to doing tests quickly, which was really important if we wanted to get things out and make changes to our features at speed. And it was putting people off doing A/B testing. So as a team of developers, we got together and we did what developers do best, and we conspired to automate Harry out of his job. Okay, that's obviously quite glib, but what I want to stress is that this automation of the third step, the analysing of the data, wasn't trivial. It took us about 2 or 3 months to deliver, and this was with a team of about 5 or 6 of us all working on it. We had to work in collaboration with Harry, who told us how we could code up basically what he did, this analysis of results looking for significance. So it was big. We produced something, the tool's called Abacus. We love it, and we're going to be open sourcing it soon, so do look out for that if you're interested in how we've implemented it. And despite being a challenge, there were a lot of benefits. In the quarter before we automated the third stage, the analysis, we ran 8 tests in the department this way. And then in the quarter after, that increased to 28. So we really did see an increase in the number of things we could test and how quickly we could do it. So by this stage, you might have decided A/B testing is a neat way to measure performance, and you have an implementation, which means your teams are set up to get results. Which of the many changes you're making do you decide to test in this way? This is my third section. How do you choose what to test? There's a bit of a limiting factor to running an A/B test. No matter how well integrated it is into your workflow, so no matter how quickly you're getting through all 3 stages, you still need to wait for a result, and you need to wait for that result to be statistically significant. This requires a large number of samples, so a large audience to the feature that you're testing, and it requires large conversion on that feature. So it requires a lot of people to be doing the thing that you're looking for them to do. That's a bit abstract, and again, I like to demonstrate this with my bag of marbles. So I want you to imagine that I'm making measurements on this bag of marbles to try and understand what the distribution of blue marbles in my bag is, what the proportion of blue marbles in my bag is. You make these measurements by taking marbles out the bag one by one, which I'm not going to do because it's going to be a mess. You can see that after maybe the first marble or the second marble, you're not going to have a very confident idea of what that looks like. You're not really going to be able to say how many blue marbles I have in my bag. But maybe by the 50th, you'll have a better idea. This is a little bit like looking for statistical significance in your results. The more people you see in your test and the more people you see converting on the action, the more blue marbles, the closer you come to understanding whether your results are significant. This means that features that have a lot of traffic and have high conversion on that traffic are quick to test. I did a bit of a calculation before I put this talk together to see how long it would take us to get a result if we were to A/B test our headlines. So our homepage, which is where you see our headlines, gets a lot of traffic. As I said, that 10 million number a day. And we get a lot of click-through on our headlines as well, so we have high conversion. If we were to A/B test the headlines, we'd perhaps put one version of headline out and compare it to another version of the headline to decide which was better, which was getting more click-throughs. To do this test would take us 15 minutes. So this is super quick. Like, this is viable. We can do the test, get the result, and make a decision off the back of it without it slowing us down. But not all tests are this quick. You'll remember that I mentioned this feature that we put out at the start of the year, the minute, for the US elections. We began to get a lot of pressure from editorial to support future versions of the minute. So they wanted the tooling to be able to produce content in this format for other events, say the Olympics or the elections in 4 years' time. Now, we wanted to know, I've shown you that we didn't really know whether the minute had the effect on our audience that we kind of hoped it would. So we needed to make a decision about whether we should support this tooling. And the way we did this was through A/B testing. Our variant in this case was an experience like the experience that we put out at the time of the US elections. So it had all the kind of jazzy tech and all the features that we needed to support. Whereas our control was just using existing formats. So we got our editors to write a version of the minute using the article formats that they already had tooled. And what we found was really interesting, which was that both our control and our variant showed this spike in visit frequency, this uplift in visit frequency. But when we looked at the difference in visit frequency between the control and the variant, there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. We'd managed to show that it kind of wasn't the minute, all this tech that we were supporting, that had caused the uplift, but rather something else. And this meant we could take our results to our editorial team and say, look, we're not going to tool it. The test took about 3 or 4 weeks to run. So in this case, it wasn't quick. But the impact of the decision was rather large. It would have taken our tools team a whole quarter to deliver that particular bit of work. So that's a group of maybe 15 or 20 people working full-time on something, which would have been really costly. And we managed to hold up the evidence of our A/B test to say, no, this doesn't make sense. We're not doing this. Maybe labored that point. But so that was an example of somewhere where the results weren't quick, but they were worth the wait. Which kind of begs the question, what do you do if you're early on in feature development? So the traffic to your feature is low and the conversions on your feature is low, but you're still keen to understand what the effects of your changes are. Is this suitable for A/B testing? So in this case, statistical significance might just take too long to reach. And we experienced this when developing a new payment feature at The Guardian, again, fairly recently. We weren't prepared to show the feature to too much of our audience in the early days because we weren't sure about it. This meant that the traffic to the feature was low, and because we hadn't iterated on it yet, the conversions on the feature was also low. When they looked at how long it was going to take them to reach a significant result, it was in the region of like many months, which is obviously far too slow to be waiting for a result if you're trying to move quickly. The team was still super keen to A/B test. They knew that this was the only way they could see that the changes they were making were down. The changes that they were seeing in the data was down to the changes that they were making. So they decided to cut a bit of a corner, which was to drop this requirement for statistical significance and instead just sort of eyeball the results after a week and say, oh, well, this one's bigger than the other one. Let's go with the assumption that led us to produce the variant. And they did this, well, didn't really go so well for them. So what ended up happening was 1 week they'd get a bit of evidence to suggest that one assumption that they'd made had been great and had really increased the number of conversions that they were seeing, the amount of payments they were seeing on the feature. They put out another test the following week, and they'd get totally contradictory results, and they'd have to go back on their assumptions and go back to the drawing board. And they went back and forth like this for a while before they realized that at this stage, A/B testing wasn't quite right for them. They didn't have enough traffic, and this statistical significance thing I keep talking about was really important. So what they did is they went back to the more traditional methods of sort of building out a feature and making it better. So they asked for user feedback, they did a bit of dashboarding, they looked at this kind of data, and they iterated on the feature enough to get it to a stage where it was seeing enough traffic. And at that point, they introduced A/B testing. Now, since then, they found that the progress that they've been making has rapidly increased. So they're managing to improve on the number of conversions that they're getting week on week, way faster than they were before getting to that stage. So in conclusion, I want you to consider using A/B testing to understand your feature performance. I've covered why, which is that it's the only method that we've tried which has isolated the changes that are due to our feature rather than those that are external to our feature. I've given you some idea of how you might want to implement it. So you can use off-the-shelf tools, or you can go down our route of developing your own, but don't underestimate just how long that takes. It was hard. And I've given you some idea of what you can test. So you've got to make sure that you strike a balance between the results that you're getting and the decisions that you can make on those, and the speed that you're getting them as well. And with perseverance, many things are suitable for this type of testing and analysis. I mentioned at the start that before we adopted this methodology, we didn't really have answers to the question of whether our features were working. We hadn't closed that feedback loop of assessing performance to understand how to iterate further. We were collecting a lot of audience data, but we found that the data that we were collecting was only really as useful as the insights we could get from it. A/B testing has been the most effective method for giving us these insights, and with some work, you can incorporate it into your current delivery process. Thank you.